In a smoking pit, somewhere beyond the limitations of space and time, a creature stirred. All around it, shadows moved. They were the shadows of the souls of men, and these shadows which moved through the bright darkness were the masters of the creature. It allowed them to master it, so long as they paid its price. In the speech of men, this creature had a name. It was called Qualnargan, and would answer to this name if called. Now it stirred. It heard its name carrying over the barriers which normally blocked its way to the earth. The calling of the name effected a temporary pathway through those intangible barriers. It stirred again as its name was called for the second time. I was unaware of why it was called or to what it was called. I was only muzzily conscious of one fact. When the pathway was opened, it could feed. It did not eat flesh, and it did not drink blood. It fed on the minds and the souls of adult men and women. Occasionally, as an appetizer, it enjoyed the morsels, the sweetmeats, as it were, of the innocent life force which it sucked from children. It ignored animals, since there was not enough awareness in an animal to savour. The creature was, for all its alien stupidity, a gourmet and a connoisseur. Now its name was called for the third time. It stirred again and flowed forward. The time was approaching when it could, once again, feed. Theleb Ka'ana shuddered. He was basically, he felt, a man of peace. It was not his fault that his avaricious love for Yashana had turned him mad. It was not his fault that, because of her, he now controlled several powerful and malevolent demons who, in return for the slaves and enemies he fed them, protected the palace of Nikorn, the merchant. He felt very strongly that none of it was his fault. It was circumstance which had damned him. He wished sadly that he had never met Yashana, never returned to her after that unfortunate episode outside the walls of Tanalorn. He shuddered again as he stood within the pentacle and summoned Qualnargan. His embryonic talent for precognition had shown him a little of the near future, and he knew that Elric was preparing to do battle with him. Theleb Ka'ana was taking the opportunity of summoning all the aid he could control. Qualnargan must be sent to destroy Elric if it could, before the albino reached the castle. Theleb Ka'ana congratulated himself that he still retained the lock of white hair which had enabled him, in the past, to send another, now deceased demon against Elric. Qualnargan knew that it was reaching its master. It propelled itself sluggishly forward and felt a stinging pain as it entered the alien continuum. It knew that its master's soul hovered before it, but for some reason was disappointingly unattainable. Something was dropped in front of it. Qualnargan scented at it and knew what it must do. This was part of its new feed. It flowed gratefully away, intent on finding its prey before the pain was too endemic, and before the pain which was endemic of a prolonged stay in the strange place grew too much. Elric rode at the head of his countrymen. On his right was Divim Tvar, the Dragon Master, and on his left Moonglum of Elhware. Behind him rode 200 fighting men, and behind them the wagons containing their loot, their war machines and their slaves. The caravan was resplendent with proud banners and the gleaming long-bladed lances of Imrir. They were clad in steel with tapering greaves, helmets and shoulder pieces. Their breastplates were polished and glinted where the long fur jerkins were open. Over the jerkins were flung bright colours of Imririan fabrics, scintillating in the watering sunshine. The archers were immediately close to Elric and his companions. They carried unstrung bone bows of tremendous power, which only they could use. On their backs were quivers crammed with black-fletched arrows. Then came the lancers, with their shining lances at a tilt to avoid the low branches of the trees. Behind these rode the main strength, the Imririan swordsmen carrying long swords and shorter stabbing weapons, which were too short to be real swords and too long to be named as knives. They rode, skirting Bakshan, for the palace of Nikorn, which lay to the north of Bakshan. They rode these men in silence. They could think of nothing to say, while Elric, their liege, led them to battle for the first time in 5 years. Stormbringer, the black hellblade, tingled under Elric's hand, anticipating a new sword quenching. Moonglum fidgeted in his saddle, nervous of the forthcoming fight, which he knew would involve dark sorcery. Moonglum had no liking for the sorceress arts, or for the creatures they spawned. To his mind, men should fight their own battles without help. They rode on, nervous and tense. Stormbringer shook against Elric's side. A faint moan emanated from the metal, and the tone was one of warning. Elric raised a hand, and the cavalcade reined to a halt. "There is something coming near which only I can deal with," he informed the men. "I will ride on ahead." He spurred his horse into a weary canter, keeping his eyes before him. Stormbringer's voice was louder, sharper, a muted shriek. The horse trembled, and Elric's own nerves were tense. He had not expected trouble so soon, and he prayed that whatever evil was lurking in the forest was not directed against him. "Arioch, be with me," he breathed. "Aid me now, and I'll dedicate a score of warriors to you. Aid me, Arioch." A foul odour forced itself into Elric's nostrils. He coughed and covered his mouth with his hands, his eyes seeking the source of the stink. The horse whinnied. Elric jumped from the saddle and slapped his mount on the rump, sending it back along the trail. He crouched warily, Stormbringer now in his grasp, the black metal quivering from point to pommel. He sensed it with the witch side of his forebears, before he saw it with his own eyes, and he recognized its shape. He himself was one of its masters. But this time he had no control over Quail Nargan. He was standing in no pentacle, and his only protection was his blade and his wits. He knew also of the power of Quail Nargan and shuddered. Could he overcome such a horror single-handedly? "Arioch! Arioch, aid me!" It was a scream, high and desperate. There was no time to conjure a spell. Quail Nargan was before him, a great green toad thing, which hopped along the trail obscenely, moaning to itself in its earth-fostered pain. It towered over Elric so that the albino was in its shadow before it was 10 feet away from him. Elric breathed steadily and screamed once more. "Arioch! Blood and souls if you aid me now!" Suddenly the toad demon leapt. Elric sprang to one side, but was caught by the long-nailed foot which sent him flying into the undergrowth. Quail Nargan turned clumsily, and its filthy mouth opened hungrily, displaying a deep, toothless cavity from which a foul odour poured. "Arioch!" In its evil and alien insensitivity, The toad thing did not even recognise the name of so powerful a demon god. It could not be frightened. It had to be fought. And as it approached Elric for the second time, the clouds belched rain from their bowels, and a downpour lashed the forest. Half blinded by the rain smashing against his face, Elric backed against a tree, his rune sword ready. In ordinary terms, Quail Nargan was blind. It could not see Elric or the forest. It could not feel the rain. It could only see and smell men's souls. Its feed. The toad demon blundered past him, and as it did so, Elric leapt high, holding his blade with both hands, and plunged it to the hilt into the demon's soft and quivering back. Flesh, or whatever earthbound stuff formed the demon's body, squelched nauseatingly. Elric pulled at the Stormbringer's hilt as the sorcerer's sword seared into the hellbeast's back, cutting down where the spine should be, but where no spine was. Quail Nargan piped its pain. Its voice was thin and reedy, even in such extreme agony. It retaliated. Elric felt his mind go numb, and then his head was filled with a pain which was not natural in any sense. He could not even shriek. His eyes widened in horror as he realised what was happening to him. His soul was being drawn from his body. He knew it. He felt no physical weakness. He was only aware of looking out, but even the awareness was fading. Everything was fading. Even the pain. Even the dreadful, hell-spawned pain. Arioch, he croaked. Savagely he summoned strength from somewhere. Not from himself, not even from Stormbringer, from somewhere. Something was aiding him at last, giving him strength, enough strength to do what he must. He wrenched the blade from the demon's back. He stood over Quail Nargan. Above him, he was floating somewhere, not in the air of the earth, just floating over the demon. With thoughtful deliberation, he selected a spot on the demon's skull, which he somehow knew to be the only spot on his body where Stormbringer might slay. Slowly and carefully, he lowered Stormbringer and twisted the rune sword through Quail Nargan's skull. The toad thing whimpered, dropped, and vanished. Elric lay sprawling in the undergrowth, trembling the length of his aching body. He picked himself up slowly. All his energy had been drained from him. Stormbringer too seemed to have lost its vitality, but that Elric knew would return, and in returning bring him new strength. But then he felt his whole frame tugged rigid. He was astounded. What was happening? His senses began to blank out. He had the feeling that he was staring down a long black tunnel which stretched into nowhere. Everything was vague. He was aware of motion. It was travelling. How or where he could not tell. For brief seconds he travelled, conscious only of an unearthly feeling of motion and the fact that Stormbringer, his life, was clutched in his right hand. Then he felt hard stone beneath him, and he opened his eyes, or was it, he wondered, that his vision returned? He looked up at the gloating face above him. "Theleb Kana," he whispered hoarsely. "How did you effect this?" The sorcerer bent down and tugged Stormbringer from Elric's enfeebled grasp. He sneered. "I followed your commendable battle with my messenger, Lord Elric. When it was obvious that somehow you had summoned aid, I quickly conjured another spell and brought you here. Now I have your sword and your strength. I know that without it you are nothing. You're in my power, Elric of Melniboné." Elric gasped air into his lungs. His whole body was pain-racked. He tried to smile, but he could not. was not in his nature to smile when he was beaten. "Give me back my sword." Theleb Ka'ana gave a self-satisfied smirk. He chuckled. "Who talks of vengeance now, Elric?" "Give me my sword." Elric tried to rise, but he was too weak. His vision blurred until he could hardly see the gloating sorcerer. "And what kind of bargain do you offer?" Theleb Ka'ana asked. "You are not a well man, Lord Elric, and sick men do not bargain. They beg." Elric trembled in impotent anger. He tightened his mouth. He would not beg, neither would he bargain. In silence he glowered at the sorcerer. "I think that first," Theleb Ka'ana said, smiling, "I shall lock this away." He hefted Stormbringer in his hand and turned towards a cupboard beside him. From his robes he produced a key with which he unlocked the cupboard and placed the rune sword inside, carefully locking the door again when he had done so. "Then I think I'll show our virile hero to his ex-mistress, sister of the man he betrayed 4 years ago." Elric said nothing. "And after that," Theleb Ka'ana continued, "my employer Nykorn shall be shown the assassin who thought he could do what others failed to achieve." He smiled. What a day. So full, so rich with pleasure. Theleb Ka'ana tittered and picked up a handbell. He rang it. A door behind Elric opened, and 2 tall desert warriors strode in. They glanced at Elric and then at Theleb Ka'ana. They were evidently amazed. "No questions," Theleb Ka'ana snapped. "Take this refuse to the chambers of Queen Yashana." Elric fumed as he was hefted up between the 2. The men were dark-skinned, bearded, and their eyes were deep-set beneath shaggy brows. They wore the heavy, wool-trimmed metal caps of their race, and their armour was not of iron, but of thick, leather-covered wood. Down a long corridor they lugged Elric's weakened body, and one of them rapped sharply on the door. Elric recognised Yashana's voice bid them enter. Behind the desert men and their burden came the tittering, fussing sorcerer. "A present for you, Yashana," he called. The desert men entered. Elric could not see Yashana, but he heard her gasp. "On the couch," directed the sorcerer. Elric was deposited on yielding fabric. He lay completely exhausted on the couch, staring up at a bright, lewd mural which had been painted on the ceiling. Yashana bent over. Elric could smell her erotic perfume. He said hoarsely, "An unprecedented reunion, Queen." Yashana's eyes were for a moment concerned. Then they hardened and she laughed cynically. "Oh, my hero has returned to me at last. But I'd rather he'd come at his own volition, not dragged here by the back of his neck like a puppy. The wolf's teeth shall be drawn, and there's no one to savage me at night." She turned away, disgust on her painted face. "Take him away, Theleb Ka'ana, you've proved your point." The sorcerer nodded. "And now," he said, "to visit Nykorn. I think he should be expecting us by this time."